7:02 in the morning. The USS Harry S. Truman was heaving into a sharp 30-degree turn toward the wind. The carrier was not supposed to be at battle stations during a routine transit of the North Arabian Sea, but the morning's calculus had changed in a heartbeat. Somewhere across the horizon, a launch had been detected that turned a standard patrol into a fight for survival. The sky was a pale, dusty blue, and the sea ran with 4-foot swells that slapped against the massive steel hull. The air smelled of salt spray and the faint, chemical tang of jet fuel from the flight deck, a scent that was suddenly overwhelmed by the electric ozone of a ship going to general quarters. The threat was a single Khalij-Fars anti-ship ballistic missile. It had been launched from a mobile battery hidden among the jagged coastal cliffs of the Iranian shoreline, more than 150 miles to the north. Moving at more than 3 times the speed of sound, the missile arched through the upper atmosphere before its seeker head locked onto the massive thermal signature of the carrier's nuclear-powered heart. On the bridge of the USS Harry S. Truman, the tactical action officer watched the primary radar screen as the contact dropped from 60,000 feet in a near-vertical terminal dive. The carrier's defensive screen was already reacting. 2 miles out, a destroyer, the USS Mason, fired a pair of Standard Missile-6 interceptors. The white streaks of their solid-fuel rocket motors tore across the sky, leaving jagged trails of smoke. One interceptor missed by less than 50 meters as the Khalij-Fars performed a high-gravity corkscrew maneuver. The second interceptor's proximity fuse detonated, shredding the missile's guidance fins with a cloud of tungsten pellets, but the momentum of the weapon was already too great to stop. The damaged ballistic missile, now a tumbling mass of high explosives and kinetic energy, slammed into the starboard side of the Truman. The impact occurred just above the waterline, aft of the midships near the number 3 elevator. The sound was not a single explosion, but a catastrophic sequence of metal tearing and air compressing. A 500-kilogram high-explosive warhead punched through the outer hull plating as if the steel were wet paper. The shockwave traveled through the ship's frame, throwing sailors off their feet in the hangar bay and shattering light fixtures 300 feet away. A fireball of orange and black erupted from the side of the ship, rising higher than the flight deck and momentarily blotting out the morning sun. Deep within the ship's 4th and 5th decks, the physical reality of the strike was even more violent. The missile had penetrated into the auxiliary machinery rooms and 2 adjacent storage compartments. The hull was ruptured, leaving a hole 4 meters wide that allowed the North Arabian Sea to come rushing in under immense pressure. The sound of the incoming water was a deafening roar that filled the lower compartments in seconds. Inside the skin of the ship, the hum of the nuclear reactors remained steady, but the internal alarms began to scream in a synchronized, haunting chorus. Damage Control Central immediately lit up with red icons. The report was clear and terrifying. 3 compartments were flooding rapidly. The ship began to list 3 degrees to starboard as thousands of tons of seawater poured into the void. In the darkened passageways, emergency lighting flickered to life, casting a dim, red glow over the faces of damage control teams who were already sprinting toward the sound of the water. They moved through thick, black smoke that smelled of scorched insulation and burning hydraulic fluid. On the flight deck, the crew did not stop. Despite the shudder that had just vibrated through the 74,000 tons of steel beneath them, the yellow shirts continued to direct aircraft. The Truman was wounded, but she was still a floating airfield, and her teeth were her only defense. The commanding officer gripped the railing of the bridge, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the smoke from the impact was still rising. He knew the first strike was rarely the last. The survival of the ship now rested on the shoulders of 19-year-old sailors wielding fire hoses and shoring timbers in the dark, flooding belly of the carrier. 7:15 in the morning. Deep within the steel labyrinth of the USS Harry S. Truman, the 22 sailors of Repair Locker 5 were already waist-deep in a rising tide of salt water and diesel fuel. The compartment was a nightmare of twisted aluminum and severed electrical cables that hissed as they shorted out against the encroaching sea. Red emergency lanterns cast long, dancing shadows against the bulkheads, making the space feel smaller and more suffocating with every passing second. The air was a thick, humid soup of steam, and the acrid stench of burnt hydraulic fluid. Yet the young men and women of the damage control team moved with the cold, mechanical precision of a veteran infantry squad. The immediate priority was to set condition zebra throughout the ship, a state of maximum watertight integrity where every hatch and scuttle was dogged shut to isolate the damage. In the third flooded compartment, a junior petty officer struggled against the weight of a heavy steel door that had been warped by the initial missile impact. The groaning of the ship's hull, a deep and metallic protest against the thousands of tons of pressure from the outside, echoed through the space like a dying beast. With a final, desperate heave and the help of 3 shipmates, the hatch was slammed shut and the handles spun into place, cutting off the primary flow of water into the adjacent machinery space. On the decks above, the ship's executive officer coordinated the effort from the damage control central station. He watched the digital status boards as they flickered from red to yellow, indicating that the flooding was being contained but not yet reversed. To counter the 3-degree list to starboard, the ballast control officer began the process of counter-flooding empty tanks on the port side. It was a delicate, high-stakes balancing act. Too much water would sink the ship lower in the waves, making her an easier target for a follow-up strike, while too little would leave the carrier unable to launch her heavy fighter jets. Down in the dark, the noise was dominated by the rhythmic throb of Pone 100 portable pumps. These gasoline-powered units were the lifeblood of the damage control effort, each one capable of moving 500 gallons of water per minute back into the Arabian Sea. The sailors worked in teams, hauling heavy suction hoses through narrow passageways and over knee-high coamings. They were soaked to the bone, their blue coveralls heavy with oil-slicked water, but no one spoke except to bark out technical readings or status reports. This was the result of thousands of hours of repetitive drills, a muscle memory that took over when the brain was screaming in panic. The struggle was most intense at the site of the primary hull rupture. The hole, a jagged wound 4 meters across, was currently being fought with emergency shoring. Sailors slammed heavy wooden beams and adjustable steel jacks against a makeshift patch of reinforced rubber and metal plating. The force of the sea was so great that it threatened to snap the 4x4 timbers, sending splinters flying through the dark compartment like shrapnel. Each time a beam groaned, 2 more sailors moved in to reinforce it, their boots slipping on the oily deck as they fought for every inch of stability. While the battle raged below the waterline, the flight deck above remained a scene of controlled chaos. The brown shirts and purple shirts moved with frantic energy, refueling the FA-18 Super Hornets that had been caught on deck during the strike. The carrier was still vibrating from the impact, and the smoke from the starboard side was being whipped across the catapults by the morning wind. Despite the danger, the mission had not changed. The Truman had to put its aircraft into the sky, or it would remain a sitting duck for the battery that had already proven it could find a gap in the Aegis shield. By 7:45 in the morning, 45 minutes after the missile had struck, the Truman had stabilized. The list had been reduced to less than 1 degree, and the primary flooding had been checked by the sheer physical labor of the repair teams. The pumps were winning the war against the rising water, and the auxiliary machinery rooms were being cleared of the waist-deep brine. The sailors of Repair Locker 5 stood in the receding water, their chests heaving, their faces masked by soot and salt. They had held the line, but the ship was still wounded, and the radar screens on the bridge were already beginning to show new, high-speed contacts emerging from the Iranian coast. 7:50 in the morning. Deep within the windowless, blue-lit cavern of the Combat Information Center on the USS Harry S. Truman, the atmosphere was thick with the hum of high-powered processors and the low, urgent murmur of tactical controllers. The air here was chilled to 60 degrees to protect the sensitive electronics, smelling faintly of recycled oxygen and the ozone of high-voltage equipment. For the 40 sailors manning the consoles, the physical shock of the missile impact was now a secondary concern to the digital war, unfolding on their screens. Their mission was to find the hand that had thrown the punch before a second one could land. The primary data stream was being fed directly from an E-2 Charlie Hawkeye airborne early warning aircraft circling 25,000 feet above the Strait of Hormuz. The crew of the Hawkeye had captured the infrared signature of the initial launch 3 minutes before the impact. By analyzing the heat bloom and the ballistic arc of the Khalij Fars missile, the ship's tactical computers were able to reverse calculate the exact point of origin. A red icon began to pulse on the main tactical display, pinpointing a location on the rugged, desolate coastline of the Hormozgan province. The coordinates were plotted at 26 degrees 42 minutes north, 55 degrees 18 minutes east. This was a region of jagged limestone cliffs and deep, sun-baked ravines that provided natural camouflage for mobile missile units. Intelligence reports had long warned of the shoot-and-scoot tactics employed by the Iranian Coastal Defense Forces, who utilized heavy transport vehicles to move their liquid-fueled missiles into pre-surveyed firing positions before retreating into reinforced tunnels. The tactical action officer adjusted his headset, his eyes locked on the high-resolution satellite feed that was now being overlaid onto the radar map. Through the haze of the morning heat, a grainy, black-and-white image showed a cleared patch of ground near the base of a steep ridge. There, partially obscured by a camouflage net that fluttered in the desert wind, was a 10-wheeled transporter erector launcher. It was positioned on a concrete pad, its massive hydraulic arm already lowering back toward the horizontal as the crew prepared to relocate the vehicle. Target confirmed, the intelligence officer announced, his voice steady. Despite the adrenaline, we have a positive ID on one Khalij Fars mobile battery. It is supported by 2 radar vans and a command and control vehicle approximately 500 meters to the east. They are attempting to bug out before we can. Cycle our birds. The Truman was not the only American asset watching. To the west, a pair of FA-18 Golf Growler electronic warfare aircraft were already beginning to flood the local frequencies with high-powered jamming signals. Their goal was to sever the link between the mobile battery and the coastal radar stations that provided the mid-course guidance for the missiles. On the screens in the Combat Information Center, the enemy's radar returns began to flicker and dissolve into snow, a digital blindness that bought the carrier strike group precious minutes of time. Despite the damage to its hull, the Harry S. Truman was functioning with the cold efficiency of a Predator. The strike group commander, seated in the flag bridge, overlooking the flight deck, reviewed the engagement plan. He knew that destroying the launcher was about more than just revenge. It was about strategic denial. If the Khalij Fars remained operational, the carrier could not move closer to the coast. To support wider operations, the battery had to be neutralized with absolute prejudice. The plan, dubbed Operation Cobalt Strike, involved a coordinated multi-axis attack. 2 FA-18 Super Hornets would provide top cover. Of 4 aircraft would deliver precision-guided munitions. The logistics were complex, requiring the flight deck crews to navigate around the smoke and debris from the missile hit to get the strike aircraft onto the catapults. The heat from the burning sections of the ship rose in shimmering waves, mixing with the exhaust of the jet engines, creating a surreal and violent landscape of iron and fire. By 8:05 in the morning, the target data had been uploaded into the mission computers of the waiting jets. The pilots, strapped into their cockpits on the steaming flight deck, watched the green shirts complete the final checks on their weapons. Each aircraft carried a lethal load of AGM-84 standoff land attack missiles and AGM-88 HARM missiles designed to home in on enemy radar emissions. They were the scalpel that would cut out the source of the threat. The carrier groaned as it adjusted course again, its damaged starboard side hidden from the wind to prevent the sea from washing over the temporary patches. The crew, below decks, continued their struggle against the water, but the focus of the ship had shifted outward. The Truman was no longer just a victim of a surprise strike. It was now the center of a concentrated, high-technology retaliation. The order was given: clear the deck, launch the strike. 8:15 in the morning. The North Arabian Sea was a shimmering expanse of hammered silver under the mounting heat of the sun, but the Serenity was a mask for the most complex electronic battleground on the planet. 5 miles to the west of the wounded carrier, the destroyer USS Mason, a DDG-51 class vessel, surged through the swells at 30 knots. Its hull, crusted with the white salt of a 7-month deployment, cut a violent white furrow through the deep blue water. On the ship's superstructure, the 4 octagonal faces of the AN/SPY-6 radar system were pulsing with invisible energy, searching the horizon for the slightest flicker of a second Iranian strike. The Truman Strike Group was no longer a collection of individual ships. It had become a single, integrated organism through a system known as Cooperative Engagement Capability. In the Combat Information Center of the USS Mason, the air was cold and smelled of floor wax and electronic coolant. The tactical controllers sat before glowing consoles, their faces illuminated by the blue light of the Aegis combat system. Through high-speed data links, the Mason was now seeing through the eyes of the E-2 Charlie Hawkeye circling overhead and the radar arrays of the Truman itself. This digital union created a steel umbrella that extended for more than 200 miles in every direction. Designate Sector 180 through 090 as high threat, the commanding officer of the Mason ordered, his voice echoing in the cramped, darkened room. Set the Standard Missile 6 battery to remote engagement. If the Truman sees it, we shoot it. The defense was organized into 3 distinct layers of overlapping lethality. The outer layer, extending out to 150 miles, was the responsibility of the Standard Missile 6 interceptors. These 20-foot-long weapons sat ready in the Mark 41 vertical launch system cells located on the Mason's foredeck and aft. Below the armored steel hatches, the missile's active radar seekers were powered up, waiting for the digital command to leap into the sky. The middle layer, between 10 and 30 miles, was held by the evolved Sea Sparrow missiles, designed to intercept targets that performed high-speed evasive maneuvers. The final, last-ditch layer consisted of the 20mm close-in weapon systems, the Gatling guns capable of firing 4,500 rounds per minute. On the bridge of the USS Mason, the heat was already rising to 35 degrees Celsius. The lookouts, wearing anti-flash hoods and gloves that covered everything but their eyes, scanned the hazy coastline of Iran through high-powered binoculars. The vibration of the ship's 4 gas turbine engines hummed through the soles of their boots, a constant reminder of the 20,000 tons of steel moving beneath them. The strategic objective of this defensive envelopment was to create a sanctified zone around the carrier. For the Truman to continue its flight operations, and for the damage control teams to finish their repairs, the ship had to be shielded from the ballistic threat. The Mason adjusted its position, moving into a station 2,000 yards off the carrier's starboard quarter, the side that had been hit. By placing itself between the carrier and the suspected launch sites, the destroyer acted as a physical and electronic shield, ready to absorb or deflect the next blow. At 8:30 in the morning, the tension reached a breaking point. The Hawkeye reported a massive spike in electronic emissions from the Iranian mainland. 2 coastal radar stations had just switched from search to target track mode. The digital map in the Mason's Combat Information Center instantly updated, drawing red lines of bearing that converged directly on the strike group's current position at 26 degrees north latitude. "Vampire! Vampire!" the electronic warfare supervisor shouted. The word vampire was the brevity code for an incoming anti-ship missile. Multiple launches detected. Bearing 045. Range 110 miles. High altitude ballistic profile. The response was instantaneous and practiced. On the foredeck of the USS Mason, the steel hatches of the Mark 41 launch system blew open. A gout of orange flame and white smoke erupted from the deck as the first Standard Missile 6 screamed into the air, its solid rocket motor pushing it to Mach 4 in seconds. 2 heartbeats later, a second missile followed, then a third. The sound was a series of rhythmic, chest-compressing thuds that shook the entire destroyer. The sky above the North Arabian Sea was suddenly etched. With the white charcoal lines of the interceptor's exhaust trails, the steel umbrella had been deployed. The Mason was now throwing its own kinetic weight against the incoming fire, attempting to shatter the Iranian volley before it could reach the wounded carrier. On the Truman, Sailors looked up from their work, watching the streaks of light climb toward the edge of space, knowing that their lives depended entirely on the silent, digital calculations happening inside the destroyer's hull. 8:45 in the morning. On the flag bridge of the aircraft carrier, the atmosphere was one of cold, calculated intensity. The compartment, situated high above the flight deck, was filled with the low hum of air conditioning and the rhythmic clicking of keyboards. The smell of ozone and stale coffee hung in the air, a stark contrast to the sharp, metallic tang of smoke that still drifted up from the jagged hole in the carrier's starboard side. The strike group commander stood at the reinforced glass windows, his eyes fixed on the horizon where the white exhaust trails of the naval warship's interceptors were still dissipating into the blue. The decision to transition from a defensive posture to an offensive strike was not made in isolation. A high-priority flash precedence message had already been transmitted to the military forces headquarters facility. Within minutes, the data from the carrier's impact and the subsequent ballistic launches had been briefed to the defense officials and the leadership. The rules of engagement were clear. The carrier strike group had the inherent right of self-defense to neutralize any immediate and ongoing threat to its personnel and assets. Admiral, we have the authorization code from command, the Flag Tactical Action Officer reported, holding a printed strip of paper. Operation Cobalt Strike is a go. The target is the mobile battery at coordinates 26 degrees, 42 minutes north, 55 degrees, 18 minutes east. We are cleared to engage all supporting radar and command assets. The commander turned away from the window, his face illuminated by the glow of the tactical displays. He knew that every second the mobile launcher remained operational was a second. The aircraft carrier remained in mortal danger. The carrier was currently operating at reduced speed to minimize the pressure on the temporary hull patches, making it a nearly stationary target for any follow-up ballistic volleys. The only way to ensure the safety of the 5,000 sailors on board was to physically destroy the enemy's ability to fire. The retaliatory order was disseminated through the ship's secure internal communications network. On the flight deck, the shooters and catapult crews received the final confirmation. The mission was not just about a single launcher. It was a suppression of enemy air defenses operation. To reach the mobile battery, the strike package would have to fly through a gauntlet of shore-based surface-to-air missiles. This required a sophisticated mix of electronic jamming and precision-guided munitions. The strike package consisted of 4 FA-18 Super Hornets from Strike Fighter Squadron 103, supported by 2 EA-18 Golf Growler electronic warfare aircraft. The Growlers would lead the way, using their high-powered jamming pods to blind the foreign military coastal surveillance radars. Behind them, the Super Hornets were loaded with a lethal combination of AGM-88 HARM missiles to kill enemy radars and 2,000-pound joint direct attack munitions to crush the mobile launcher and its reinforced concrete hide site. The commanding officer of the carrier spoke over the ship's general announcing system, his voice calm and steady. "This is the captain. We have taken a hit, but we are still in the fight. Our damage control teams have stabilized the ship, and now it is time for the air wing to do its job. We are launching a retaliatory strike to neutralize the threat. Stand fast and stay focused on your duties. We are the carrier, and we do not back down." Below the flight deck, in the ready rooms, the pilots performed their final checks. They were young men and women, many on their first combat deployment. Yet their movements were deliberate and professional. They knew the risks of flying into the teeth of a prepared coastal defense network, but the sight of the smoke rising from their own ship had replaced any fear with a grim sense of purpose. They adjusted their flight gear, gripped their helmets, and headed for the ladders leading to the flight deck. The logistics of the launch were complicated by the damage. The number 3 elevator was out of commission, and the starboard side of the deck was restricted due to the ongoing firefighting and repair efforts. This meant the yellow shirts had to choreograph a complex dance to move the strike aircraft to catapults 1 and 2 on the bow. The jet blast deflectors rose with a mechanical whine, and the first Super Hornet taxied into position, its engines screaming as it tested the afterburners. At 9 in the morning, the final authorization was given. The strike group commander watched from the bridge as the first aircraft was hurled off the deck, disappearing into the morning haze in a blur of gray steel and orange flame. The retaliation had begun. The military forces Navy was no longer simply absorbing the blow, it was reaching across the water to strike back at the source of the fire. 9:05 in the morning. The FA-18 Super Hornets of Strike Fighter Squadron 103 were screaming on the bow catapults of the USS Harry S. Truman. The aircraft, painted in tactical low-visibility gray, strained against the holdback bars as their twin General Electric 404 engines pushed into full afterburner. The heat from the exhaust was a physical wall, shimmering in massive waves that distorted the view of the North Arabian Sea. Below the flight deck, the massive steam pistons of Catapult 1 were pressurized to more than 400 pounds per square inch, holding back a kinetic energy that was ready to be unleashed in a fraction of a second. The air on the flight deck was a violent cocktail of salt spray, the sharp chemical bite of JP-5 jet fuel, and the searing heat of the catapult tracks. The yellow shirts moved with practiced, rhythmic signals, their hands cutting through the hazy air to guide the multi-million-dollar machines into their final launch positions. Despite the black smoke still drifting from the missile wound on the ship's starboard side, the crew worked with the cold efficiency of a machine. Every sailor knew that the faster these wings were in the air, the safer the 5,000 souls on the Truman would be. The first to launch were the two EA-18 Golf Growlers. These electronic warfare variants of the Super Hornet were the eyes and ears of the strike package. As the catapult fired, the Growlers were hurled from 0 to 160 knots in under 3 seconds. The pilots' bodies slammed back into their seats by the 4G force of the acceleration. Once airborne, the Growlers immediately activated their AN/ALQ-99 jamming pods. These high-powered systems began to flood the electromagnetic spectrum with digital noise, specifically targeting the frequencies used by the Iranian coastal radar sites. On the enemy's screens, the clear picture of the American strike group began to dissolve into a chaotic mess of ghost targets and static. Following the Growlers were the 4 strike-rolled FA-18 Super Hornets. Each aircraft was heavily laden with a specific mission loadout. Under the wings, they carried AGM-88 HARM missiles, designed to home in on the electronic emissions of surface-to-air missile batteries. For the primary target, the Mobile Ballistic Launcher, each jet carried 2,000-pound Joint Direct Attack munitions. These satellite-guided bombs were capable of punching through several meters of reinforced concrete, making them the ideal weapon for destroying the shoot and scoot assets hidden in the Iranian cliffs. The flight toward the coast was conducted at low altitude, barely 500 feet above the white-capped waves. This sea-skimming profile allowed the strike package to use the curvature of the Earth to stay below the horizon of the long-range Iranian search radars for as long as possible. The pilots adjusted their oxygen masks, their eyes scanning the tactical displays on their heads-up units. The digital map showed the red line of the coast approaching at a speed of 900 kilometers per hour. To the left and right, the wingmen maintained a tight combat spread, their wings overlapping in a formation that maximized their defensive sensor coverage. Strike lead. This is Hawkeye. The voice of the controller from the E-2 Charlie came through the encrypted radio link. Target is still active. We have detected secondary movement at the Hyde site. The command vehicle is attempting to relocate to the north. You are cleared for hot run on arrival. The lead pilot, a commander with over 2,000 flight hours, toggled his master arm switch to the on position. He could see the hazy brown outline of the Hormozgan coastline beginning to rise out of the blue water. The terrain was a jagged wasteland of limestone and sand, a landscape that looked as if it had been scorched by the sun since the beginning of time. He checked his fuel state and the health of his wingman systems. Everything was green. The environment inside the cockpit was a stark contrast to the violence of the mission. It was a world of quiet, high-technology precision, where the only sounds were the steady hiss of the oxygen system and the low, tonal growl of the radar warning receiver. But the pilots were acutely aware of the stakes. They were representing the combined power of the military forces Navy, carrying the weight of a wounded ship and a determined nation. The coordinates for the mobile battery were locked into the mission computers, and the distance to target counter was clicking down towards 0. By 9:20 in the morning, the strike package was 30 miles from the coast. The EA-18 Golf Growlers increased their jamming power, creating a digital blind spot that moved with the formation. The pilots could see the white surf breaking against the base of the foreign military cliffs. They were minutes away from the engagement zone, entering the most dangerous phase of the mission, where the enemy's short-range defenses would be most lethal. The wings of the fleet were over the target area, and the time for stealth was over. 9:25 in the morning. The coast of Iran, 12 miles north of Bandar Abbas, the 4 FA-18 Super Hornets and 2 EA-18 Golf Growlers crossed the shoreline at 900 kilometers per hour. The rugged limestone cliffs of the Hormozgan province rushed beneath their wings, casting long, sharp shadows against the sun-bleached rock. The air in the cockpit was dry and smelled of bottled oxygen, a sharp contrast to the humid, salt-thick atmosphere of the Persian Gulf below. Every sensor in the strike package was now screaming as the Iranian coastal defense network clawed at the digital blindness created by the Growlers. The mission had reached its terminal phase. The pilots of Strike Fighter Squadron 103 were no longer flying a routine patrol. They were the executioners of a coordinated military response. The lead pilot adjusted his heads-up display, aligning the green targeting reticle, with the thermal signature of the mobile launcher hidden beneath the camouflage netting. Beside him, his wingman maintained a tight 3-meter separation, their aircraft moving as a single, lethal entity through the turbulent air of the coastal ridges. The lead Super Hornet pilot squeezed the trigger on the control stick. The AGM-88 HAR missile shrieked off its wing rail with a violent, white-hot roar that shook the entire airframe. A massive plume of white smoke trailed behind the weapon as it accelerated to twice the speed of sound toward the enemy radar. The cockpit was momentarily washed in a blinding orange glare as the missile's rocket motor ignited, leaving the scent of scorched propellant in the air. 3 seconds later, the warhead punched straight through the parabolic dish of the Iranian target tracking radar. The detonation was a massive fireball that bleached the desert floor white, sending shards of steel and glass flying 500 meters in every direction. The command van, situated 20 meters away, was crushed by the overpressure, its sides caving in like a soda can under a boot. Black smoke and the smell of burning electronics erupted from the wreckage. As the radar array collapsed into a heap of twisted metal, the Iranian battery did not remain passive. 2 HQ-9 surface-to-air missiles erupted from their canisters, their flight paths jagged as they fought through the electronic jamming of the Growlers. The lead pilot kicked the rudder hard left, the aircraft groaning under a 7G turn that squeezed the blood from his head. The first missile exploded in a cloud of shrapnel 50 meters behind his tail, the shockwave rattling the cockpit glass and snapping the aircraft's nose upward. The sky was now a chaotic lattice of white smoke trails and black bursts of anti-aircraft fire. The secondary Super Hornets rolled into their final bombing runs, their target acquisition lasers locking onto the mobile ballistic launcher as it tried to flee into a nearby ravine. The initial exchange had stripped away the battery's eyes, leaving the launcher exposed and vulnerable to the heavy ordnance following behind. Following the suppression of the radar, the remaining Super Hornets initiated their high-angle dive toward the primary target. The mobile launcher, a massive 10-wheeled vehicle, was attempting to accelerate toward the entrance of a reinforced tunnel. From an altitude of 15,000 feet, the American jets released 4 2,000-pound Joint Direct Attack munitions. These heavy bombs used internal satellite guidance to adjust their tail fins, falling with terrifying precision through the desert haze. The impact of the 4 bombs was simultaneous. The mountain ridge itself seemed to shudder as 4,000 kilograms of high explosives detonated inside the ravine. The mobile launcher did not simply catch fire. It was vaporized. The intense heat of the explosion ignited the liquid fuel remaining in the launcher's missile canisters, creating a secondary blast that sent a column of fire 200 meters into the air. The reinforced tunnel entrance collapsed under the weight of the falling rock, effectively sealing the Iranian facility for good. As the strike package pulled out of their dives, the pilots scanned for secondary threats. To the south, a battery of 35mm anti-aircraft guns opened fire, filling the air with a wall of lead and tracers. The Growlers responded by dropping bundles of chaff and flares, the bright magnesium sparks burning like fallen stars against the brown hills. One Super Hornet took a light hit to its vertical stabilizer from a piece of shrapnel, but the dual redundant flight control system compensated instantly, allowing the pilot to maintain formation. The results of the engagement were devastating for the foreign military coastal forces. Preliminary battle damage assessment confirmed the total destruction of the mobile launcher, 2 radar vans, a command vehicle, and an estimated 25 personnel killed in action. The coastal defense network in this sector had been effectively decapitated, leaving a gap in the enemy's situational awareness that extended for 60 miles. On the armed forces side, all 6 aircraft remained airborne and combat-capable, despite the intensity of the surface-to-air fire encountered during the ingress. By 9:40 in the morning, the strike package turned back toward the sea, leaving behind a graveyard of burning steel and shattered limestone. The pilots could see the aircraft carrier on the horizon, still trailing a thin line of gray smoke but standing firm in the water. The message to the adversary was clear. Any strike against a foreign military carrier would be met with an immediate and overwhelming erasure of the source. The wings of the fleet had delivered their judgment, and now they were returning home to a ship that had refused to sink. 9:50 in the morning. The flight deck of the USS Harry S. Truman had undergone a somber transformation. The aggressive roar of the catapults had fallen silent, replaced by the rhythmic, heavy thrum of MH-60 Sierra helicopters. These multi-mission aircraft, painted in the same tactical gray as the fighters, were now the primary lifeline for the sailors injured in the initial missile strike. The air around the designated landing spots was a violent swirl of hot salt spray, mixed with the sharp, clean smell of medical-grade antiseptic. The sun was high now, beating down on the steel deck with a relentless heat that made the non-skid surface burn through the thick soles of flight boots. The focus of the ship's 3,000 personnel had shifted from the external threat to the internal human cost. While the damage control teams had successfully checked the flooding in the lower compartments, the medical department, known simply as medical, was operating at its maximum capacity. The carrier functioned as a floating Level 2 trauma center, but for the most critically injured, the objective was the golden hour. This was the 60-minute window after a traumatic injury where specialized surgical intervention was most likely to prevent death. Inside the carrier's primary triage ward, the scene was one of disciplined urgency. The white-tiled floors were marked with colored tape to designate the severity of injuries. United States Navy corpsmen and surgeons moved between stretchers with practiced efficiency, their blue scrubs stained with the sweat of a 3-hour marathon of emergency procedures. The sound in the ward was a chaotic mix of heart monitors beeping, the hiss of portable oxygen tanks, and the low, calm voices of medical officers giving orders. "We have 42 personnel accounted for as injured," the senior medical officer reported to the bridge via the secure internal line. 12 are in critical condition with a combination of blast overpressure injuries and third-degree burns. 3 sailors have been confirmed killed in action. We need to begin immediate transport for the critical cases to the Regional Medical Center in Bahrain. The casualty evacuation, or CASVAC, was a masterpiece of military logistics. As each MH-60 Sierra helicopter touched down on the vibrating deck, a team of 4 stretcher bearers moved in. They ran low to the ground to stay beneath the spinning rotor blades, their bodies buffeted by the intense downwash. The transition from the triage ward to the helicopter was a race against time, performed with a silence that was more profound than any shout. The yellow shirts on deck coordinated the movements with hand signals, ensuring that the path for the stretchers remained clear of debris and ongoing repair equipment. By 10:15 in the morning, the first wave of 3 helicopters lifted off from the Truman. Each aircraft carried 2 critical patients and a flight medic, who continued to monitor vital signs mid-air. The helicopters climbed steeply, turning west toward the medical facilities on the mainland. From the air, the pilots could see the jagged hole in the Truman's side, a reminder of how close the ship had come to a much greater catastrophe. Below them, the North Arabian Sea remained a deep, indifferent blue, but the wake of the carrier was a white scar that stretched for miles. The emotional weight of the evacuation was felt by every sailor on the ship. On a United States Navy carrier, the crew is a tight-knit community, where everyone has a specific role and a shared destiny. The sight of the stretchers being loaded into the Sierra helicopters was a stark reminder of the reality of high-end naval combat. Yet, there was no sign of a break in morale. Instead, the crew worked with a renewed, grim intensity. The engineers in the machinery rooms continued to monitor the temporary pumps, and the lookouts on the bridge never let their binoculars stray from the horizon. On the flight deck, the purple shirts began to refuel the remaining helicopters, their movements synchronized and rapid. The logistics of survival required that the Truman maintain a constant ready state for further medical evacuations or search and rescue missions. The carrier was no longer just a weapon of war. It was a home that was protecting its own. The wounded were being moved to safety, but the heart of the ship remained centered on the mission. By 10:45 in the morning, the last of the critical casualties had been cleared from the Truman's deck. The triage ward began the process of decontaminating the floors and replenishing the supplies of plasma and bandages. The immediate medical crisis had passed into a stage of monitoring and recovery. The Truman was still trailing a faint plume of smoke, and 3 compartments remained sealed behind heavy steel doors. But the ship was holding. The cost of the morning's engagement was now written in the medical logs and the somber faces of the crew, but the Harry S. Truman remained a sovereign piece of American territory, defiant in the face of the fire. 11:15 in the morning. The USNS Supply, a fast combat support ship of the Military Sealift Command, was already closing the distance to the USS Harry S. Truman. The 2 massive vessels were running in parallel at a steady speed of 15 knots, separated by only 180 feet of churning, white-capped water. This was an underway replenishment, but the atmosphere was far from routine. Typically, such an operation involved the transfer of fuel and food. Today, the heavy lift lines were carrying the specialized materials required to keep a 74,000-ton aircraft carrier from succumbing to the structural stresses of a ballistic missile strike. The sun was a white-hot disk directly overhead, and the air between the 2 hulls was a pressurized tunnel of salt spray and the deafening roar of massive diesel engines. The environment was a high-stakes arena of physics and seamanship, where any error in steering would be measured. In a collision between tens of thousands of tons of steel, the orange shirts on the USNS Supply and the deck department sailors on the Truman worked with a frantic, rhythmic energy. They fired line-throwing guns across the gap, the thin lead lines, trailing behind them like spiderwebs before being used to haul over the thick, braided steel cables of the Highline system. The primary cargo for this transfer was known as battle damage repair kits. Within minutes of the lines being tensioned, massive wooden pallets began to slide across the chasm between the ships. These pallets were loaded with hundreds of 4x4 Douglas fir shoring timbers, adjustable steel trench jacks, and heavy-duty hydraulic spreaders. While high-technology missiles had caused the damage, it was these ancient, tactile materials that would provide the structural reinforcement needed to keep the carrier's internal bulkheads from buckling under the pressure of the North Arabian Sea. Deep within the darkened, oil-slicked compartments of the 4th deck, the hull technicians were waiting. These sailors were the ship's blacksmiths and structural engineers, trained to work in the most hazardous conditions imaginable. As the new timber arrived, they began the grueling process of shoring. They measured and cut the wooden beams to fit precisely between the warped deck plates and the overhead bulkheads. The smell in these lower spaces was a nauseating mix of stagnant seawater, spilled diesel fuel, and the metallic tang of grinding steel. The only light came from the blue sparks of portable welding torches, and the dim glow of emergency lanterns. The structural integrity of the USS Harry S. Truman was currently maintained by a series of temporary cofferdams and patches. The hull technicians were using a specialized underwater epoxy and thick steel plates to create a secondary seal over the 4-meter hole in the starboard side. Every time the carrier crested a large swell, the hull groaned with a deep, vibratory protest that could be felt in the soles of the sailors' boots. The pressure on the temporary patches was immense, and the sound of the water pressing against the steel was a constant, haunting reminder of the ocean's desire to reclaim the ship. Logistics also extended to the operational heart of the carrier, the flight deck. The USNS Supply transferred hundreds of feet of high-tension electrical cabling and replacement hydraulic lines to repair the damage sustained near the number 3 elevator. Without these parts, the Truman would remain mission-degraded, unable to cycle its full complement of 75 aircraft. The green shirts of the maintenance department worked alongside the hull technicians, stripping away scorched insulation and rewiring the critical systems that powered the catapults and the arresting gear. At 12:30 in the afternoon, the fuel lines were connected. Despite the damage, the Truman needed to top off its tanks. The carrier was burning thousands of gallons of fuel every hour just to maintain the electrical power required for its radar systems and damage control pumps. The purple shirts monitored the gauges with intense focus, ensuring that the pressure remained steady even as the two ships rolled in the 4-meter swells. The transfer of nearly 1 million gallons of DF2 marine diesel and JP5 jet fuel was completed in less than 90 minutes, a testament to the professional discipline of the Military Sealift Command. The logistics of survival was not a singular event, but a continuous, grinding process. While the world's attention was fixed on the spectacular images of the retaliatory strike against the foreign military coast, the real battle for the Truman was being fought with wrenches, welding leads, and wooden beams. By 1:15 in the afternoon, the USNS Supply cast off the lines and peeled away to the west. Its mission accomplished. The carrier was now heavily reinforced, its internal wounds bandaged with steel and timber. The ship was no longer in immediate danger of sinking, but it remained a scarred veteran of a new and violent era of naval warfare. 1600 in the afternoon. The USS Harry S. Truman was positioned at latitude 25 degrees 40 minutes north, 54 degrees 35 minutes east. The sun was beginning its long descent toward the horizon, casting a deep, golden light over the Persian Gulf. From a distance of 5 miles, the carrier still looked like a titan of the sea, its silhouette sharp against the shimmering water. Only the thin, lingering trail of gray smoke from its starboard side and the visible jagged rent in its hull told the story of the morning's violence. The carrier strike group had moved into a defensive box formation, with the USS Mason and the cruiser CG-73 flanking the wounded flagship. The final damage assessment was delivered to the Indo-Pacific Command via secure satellite link. The Khalij Fars missile had caused significant structural damage to 3 primary compartments, but the integrity of the ship's nuclear propulsion system remained at 100%. The floodwaters had been completely pumped out, and the temporary shoring was holding steady against the pressure of the sea. While the number 3 elevator was non-operational and would require shipyard repair, had successfully maintained its flight deck certification throughout the engagement. The carrier was wounded, but its mission readiness was still rated at 85%. The cost of the engagement was recorded with somber precision. 3 United States Navy sailors were confirmed killed in action during the initial impact. 42 personnel were injured, with 12 evacuated to the Regional Medical Center for specialized treatment. In terms of equipment, the strike group had expended 12 Standard Missile, 6 interceptors, 4 AGM-88 HARM missiles, and 8 2,000-pound Joint Direct Attack munitions. 1 FA-18 Super Hornet had sustained minor shrapnel damage but remained flight-capable. The economic cost of the munitions alone was measured in the tens of millions of dollars, yet the strategic value of the carrier remained intact. The results for the opposing force were absolute. Satellite imagery and signals intelligence confirmed the total destruction of the mobile ballistic missile battery. The strike had eliminated 1 transporter erector launcher, 2 high-frequency radar vans, and the regional command and control node. An estimated 25 enemy personnel were killed in the retaliatory strike. The shoot and scoot capability of the coastal defense forces in this sector had been neutralized, creating a 60-mile wide corridor, where the military forces Navy could now operate with significantly reduced risk from ballistic threats. Strategically, the day had proven the resilience of the carrier strike group. The Aegis combat system, combined with the integrated defense of the naval warship, had successfully intercepted 4 follow-up ballistic missiles, preventing what could have been a catastrophic loss of life. The rapid transition from a defensive posture to an offensive strike demonstrated the professional discipline of the air wing and the deck crews. The Strait of Hormuz remained open to international shipping, and the message to the region was undeniable. The military forces Navy possessed the capacity to absorb a high-end kinetic strike and immediately erase the source of that fire. As the first stars began to appear in the darkening sky, the USS Harry S. Truman turned its bow toward the open ocean. The ship would eventually require a period of dry dock repair at Naval Station Rota, but for now, it remained on station. The yellow shirts were already preparing the deck for the evening's combat air patrol launches. In the lower decks, the hull technicians continued to monitor the shoring, their faces weary, but their resolve unshaken. The iron discipline of the crew had saved the ship, and the power of the air wing had settled the score. The engagement of the 12th of January, 2026, would be studied by naval tacticians for decades. It was a testament to the fact that in modern warfare, the winner is not the one who strikes first, but the one who can sustain the hit and strike back with more precision. The Truman was still afloat, its flags flying. In the evening breeze, a 330-meter symbol of American resolve. The battle was over, the threat was neutralized, and the fleet remained the master of the sea.